JTV. It's part 2 of Emperor King Selassie's. We want to look at his death and what happened after, the following events after, and some of the leading events up to his death.
History. One name stands out among the rest: Haile Selassie I, the 225th and final emperor of Ethiopia. From 1930 until his overthrow in 1974, he ruled the country and left an indelible mark on its destiny. This visionary leader brought Ethiopia onto the world stage. He steered the nation into the League of Nations and later the United Nations, while making Addis Ababa the vibrant center for the Organization of African Unity, today known as the African Union. Ironically, Emperor Haile Selassie initiated the changes that led to his downfall, with examples being the military training program that exposed Ethiopian officers to representative institutions in the United States, and the Haile Selassie I University, where students learned to think about political economy. As time went on, the emperor could not seem to adapt to new concepts, and he lost touch with his subjects. On September 12, 1974, Ethiopia stood at a crossroads. Emperor Haile Selassie was deposed by the Coordinating Committee of the Armed Forces, Police and Territorial Army, known as the DERG. This Soviet-backed military junta would go on to govern Ethiopia for nearly 2 decades. In this episode of African Biographics, we delve deeper into the factors that precipitated the fall of a ruler who was once revered by millions.
There was a lot of really young guys.
Born Tafari Makkonen in 1892, Emperor Haile Selassie was an iconic figure of the 20th century. After a struggle for the throne in 1916, the young Selassie emerged first as regent, then as emperor of Ethiopia from 1930. Over the course of his rule, the emperor abolished slavery, introduced constitutional reform, and expanded access to education for the masses. Emperor Haile Selassie faced a major challenge when Italy invaded Ethiopia in the 1930s, forcing him to flee to England for 5 years. He returned to his homeland and led it through the Second World War. One of the major reforms in the regime of Haile Selassie was in the education sector. His government even sent youth graduates from Ethiopia for further studies abroad, hoping to create a loyal and skilled elite. After the first attempted coup against him in the early 1960s, the emperor engineered the establishment of the Haile Selassie I University, a significant step towards higher education in Ethiopia. The emperor was confident that the educated youth would prioritize securing jobs rather than challenging the status quo. Now, over the next decade, the university students in particular, the very group Selassie had always fervently believed needed to have their education prioritized, began to actively move against their monarch. At the university, students engaged in revolutionary discussions, but they remained relatively restrained as Haile Selassie maintained his firm grip on power. However, Ethiopia soon became engulfed by student movements that increasingly embraced leftist and communist-style ideologies. For this new generation, Haile Selassie was no longer a figure to be admired, but a bourgeoisie bureaucrat to be deplored. 1969 to 1970, at the Haile Selassie I University campus became a focal point of political unrest. The university became a breeding ground for impassioned student protests as the students were determined to make their voices heard. In turn, the emperor reluctantly allowed the establishment of a student union and newspaper. It soon became apparent, however, that this newspaper would not toe the line of state-controlled media. Articles and poems surfaced, thinly veiling their criticism of the country and its leader. The student protests reached a boiling point in December 1969 when a student leader was killed, allegedly by the Imperial Security Services. This sparked a massive demonstration that turned violent, resulting in the deaths of 23 students. Emperor Selassie attempted to restore order by publicly dismissing the Minister of Education. Behind closed doors, however, his men employed brutal tactics to pacify the campus. While subsequent years did not witness similarly deadly events, the students continued their protests, enduring beatings, imprisonment, and interrogations. Exacerbating matters even further for the emperor was the terrible famine that struck northeastern Ethiopia in 1972 and 1973. By July of 1973, an estimated 1.8 million people in the 4 northern provinces of Tigray, Wollo, Northern Shore, and Bekamenda were affected by the drought, while huge losses of livestock were impoverishing the people of the region. By the end of 1973, the impact of the drought on the country's politics could no longer be ignored. Between 50,000 and 100,000 people in central Ethiopia had died. Massive aid was urgently required, and even so, it would take several years to build up the cattle herds again. 13 refugee camps were established in Wollo province. Unfortunately, relief was hampered by the inaccessibility of the region. Following student protests in Addis Ababa, the government asked friendly countries for help, but its first appeals were low-key as it did not wish to admit to a major crisis. However, a great proportion of the medical and food supplies that were poured into the famine area by the government never reached their destinations. Instead, corrupt government administrators and their aides sold the relief supplies or kept them. The government did act quickly to deal with this issue, and most of the profiteers were rounded up for trial. Foolishly, the government did not give the famine wide publicity and was accused of minimizing the facts. The Ministry of the Interior did want publicity, but the Ministry of Tourism did not, while the government was averse to publicizing the corruption that had been uncovered for fear of giving Ethiopia a bad name. By now, unrest seemed to have taken hold of all segments of Ethiopian society. In 1973, gas prices rose sharply due to the embargo that the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries had placed on several countries in light of the Yom Kippur War. This led to several more protests, especially among taxi workers and similar driver-based professions who could no longer work due to the high gas prices. However, like many leaders out of touch with those under their charge, Haile Selassie never imagined that the protesters represented the true sentiment of the Ethiopian people. For him, it was merely a fringe group of radicals and nothing more. Yet the protest movement in Ethiopia would only continue to grow. A real problem came when the once loyal military began to protest as well, demanding an increase in their wages. On January 12, 1974, enlisted men at an army outpost in Negele, southern Ethiopia, mutinied against their senior officers in protest of poor food and a shortage of water. Their water pump had broken down. Now, when their seniors refused to allow them the use of their well, they were imprisoned. The mutineers then sent a petition to the emperor asking for their grievances to be remedied. Emperor Haile Selassie responded by sending an army general as his envoy to investigate the matter, but he too was detained. Despite the blatant insubordination of the soldiers, Selassie promised an improvement in the mutineers' conditions and decided against any punishment. The news of this mutiny spread to every army unit in the country. In Addis Ababa, rebel officers in the 4th Division took 8 ministers hostage, demanding they be sacked for corruption. Once again, Haile Selassie responded with more concessions, sacking a bevy of senior officers and further increasing pay and allowances.
Can I see your brand posts?
Yeah, sure.
How the heck did you make these posts? Your brand looks like Gucci.
Well, I kind of stole Gucci.
In Addis Ababa in early 1974, and the following brief summary of events shows how Emperor Selassie's regime was irrevocably losing its grip on power. The members of this shadowy coordinating committee, later known as the Derg, numbered around 120 and came from the rank and file and the junior officers up to the rank of captain of the entire military, the army, the police, and even the militia, traditionally looked down upon by the military establishment. For many months the Derg had remained in the shadows. None of the names of its members were announced, and its activities were kept hidden from the general public. With no organized political parties to challenge them, it was as if this revolution had landed in their lap. From February to September 1974, the Derg had begun carrying out what is often referred to as a creeping coup d'etat. They steadily gained power and slowly started arresting and executing individuals associated with Haile Selassie's regime. The Derg's reasons for staging this creeping coup were grievances accumulated over the years, including a semi-feudal system, low salaries for the military, overtaxation, famines, and autocratic land seizures, which fueled nationwide protests. As members of the Derg expanded beyond the original leaders who had initiated the revolt, rivalry and competition for leadership caused the core body to reaffirm its power and elect an individual the leaders saw as lacking a strong social base and therefore malleable as its chairman. Unfortunately, this move was a tragic mistake. Eventually, Mengistu Haile Mariam, an obscure man with the rank of captain who had a reputation for drunken brawling, emerged as the leader of the Derg. Mengistu Haile Mariam turned out to be what no one had anticipated, an ambitious man determined to ascend to the summit of power. The Derg moved cautiously at first, as it was unsure of how much resistance it would encounter from the emperor, the aristocracy, and loyal units of the armed forces. But stage by stage, as it grew in confidence, the Derg began to dismantle the whole imperial structure. During July and August of 1974, it issued long lists of names of palace functionaries, high government officials, and prominent aristocrats, including the emperor's closest advisors, calling on them to give themselves up or face confiscation of their assets. Most of them surrendered voluntarily, but some were arrested by force. Hundreds of them were incarcerated in the basements of buildings in the Grand Palace. Emperor Haile Selassie was left at the Jubilee Palace with only a handful of personal servants. The Derg turned next to the emperor himself. In the government press, on the radio, and on the television, a barrage of attacks were unleashed on his regime, condemning it for corruption and exploitation. Emperor Selassie was accused of squandering the country's meager resources on expensive trips abroad and of being willfully negligent over the wall of famine. The Derg had hostile propaganda demystifying the emperor, including showing a film of him feeding cows at a time when people were dying during the wall of famine. On 25 August 1974, the Jubilee Palace was nationalized and renamed the National Palace. Sadly, there was to be no dignified exit for Emperor Haile Selassie and his relatives. At a 4-day secret meeting in early September, the Derg voted to dethrone Haile Selassie. On 11 September, 9 princesses, including the emperor's sole surviving daughter and 7 granddaughters, were imprisoned in a dungeon-like cell, their heads shaved, and allowed only 2 mattresses to share between them. On the same day, officers from the Derg interrogated Haile Selassie on the whereabouts of the fortune that he had amassed over the years, but he vehemently denied possessing any fortune. On September 12, 1974, 6 months after the revolution broke out, the Derg announced the overthrow of Emperor Haile Selassie's regime and his replacement by a constitutional monarchy. The emperor's ailing son, Crown Prince Asfa Wosen, was named monarch. He, however, rejected this proclamation, referring to it as illegitimate. The creeping coup had come to an end. Emperor Haile Selassie was pushed off the stage of history, which he had dominated for over half a century. All hopes of establishing a civilian democratic system after the end of his rule were dashed when the Derg established a military government. News that the emperor had been deposed had been broadcast on radio early that morning. Addis Ababa was crowded with joyous celebrations. As the emperor was taken in a Volkswagen Beetle to his place of detention, the crowd shouted words of abuse. In March of 1975, the Derg officially abolished the Ethiopian monarchy, thereby putting an end to a dynasty that had spanned thousands of years. Meanwhile, Emperor Haile Selassie I is said to have remained in detention for some months before he was taken to the Old Palace, where he died 1 year after his overthrow. The manner of his death is shrouded in mystery. One tale has it that he was quietly murdered by Mengistu and secretly buried underneath the office from which Mengistu would rule Ethiopia for 17 years. But the fact is that Emperor Haile Selassie I died a lonely death with few to mourn him. Most of his relatives were either dead, exiled, or in detention, and his ministers and the palace hangers-on were either detained or had dispersed.
Yes, a moment of silence for Emperor Haile Selassie.
The emperor, I think, kind of built in this appreciation of what was happening in the rest of the continent.
For many, many years, he could not trust anybody else. He himself was Minister of Education.
He was really a very special, God-gifted person.
hereditary rulers until its abolition in 1975. The emperors traced their origins back to biblical times. It was widely believed that they descended directly from the marriage of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. In 1974, Ethiopia entered a period of profound political, economic, and social change, frequently accompanied by violence. A period that historians would refer to as the Ethiopian Revolution. The confrontation between traditional and modern forces erupted and changed the entire nature of the Ethiopian state forever. In this 4-part series, Afrhistory will take you through the history of the Ethiopian Revolution. Part 1. On the 2nd of November 1930, Rastafari Makonnen was crowned as the Emperor of Ethiopia. During his coronation, he changed his name to Emperor Haile Selassie, which meant power to the Trinity. It was here that his rule officially began, ruling Ethiopia a record of 44 years until his overthrow in 1974. Throughout his rule, Selassie attempted to modernize the country through a series of political and social reforms, including the introduction of Ethiopia's first written constitution in 1931 and the abolition of slavery. In 1930, Italy under Benito Mussolini invaded and occupied Ethiopia. The emperor was toppled and later left for exile in England. However, when Italy joined the Second World War on the side of Hitler, Britain declared war on Mussolini and his colonial possessions. And so, in 1940, Italy was defeated in the East African Campaign and the emperor was reinstated as the ruler of Ethiopia by the British. On return, Selassie dissolved the Federation of Eritrea and Ethiopia, which had been established by the UN General Assembly. He then integrated Eritrea as a province of Ethiopia, among other reasons to have access to the Red Sea, a move that was backed by the US, who also wanted a secure base in Massawa and Asmara. However, this move would later be among his undoing for him as well as his successors. During the 1960s, the emperor faced strong resistance on several fronts. An Oromo uprising erupted in the Bale province in southern Ethiopia, lasting for 7 years. Somali insurgents in Ogaden formed the West Somali Liberation Front, aiming to drive out the Ethiopians and create an independent state. In Eritrea, the Eritrean Liberation Front launched a war of independence against Ethiopia that eventually required an entire division of Haile Selassie's troops to contain.
Buy your dream furniture, interest-free. Grow your home with Oak Furniture Land today.
The situation couldn't have been worse for the emperor, when an increasingly radical student movement in Addis Ababa, the capital, labeled him as an American puppet and his feudal landlords as the enemy of the people. Under the motto, "Land to the tiller," the students sought to limit property size and rights. In retaliation, the emperor suppressed all revolts through brutal methods, leaving no room for dissent. A special treatment was given to Eritrea and Ogaden, where burning and bombing of villages took place indiscriminately, leading to civilian casualties. As a result, the monarchy gradually lost its credibility in these regions and back home. To tighten his grip on power, the emperor employed feudal landlords, the church, and the military to maintain his rule. Now, this is how it worked. The feudal landlords managed the provincial administration and taught people to obey the commands of their rulers. The church attributed divine powers to the emperor, and the whole socio-economic structure was maintained through the army, which controlled the country with ruthlessness. For centuries, the monarchy relied on a feudal mode of production, which had been the major element of the Ethiopian economy, with land being the most important means of production. However, land had been grabbed by the church, owning 25%, the emperor and his family 20%, the feudal landlords 30%, and the state 18%, leaving a mere 7% to the 23 million odd Ethiopian peasants. In addition, the landless peasants surrendered as much as 75% of their produce to the feudal landlords as a form of tax. By 1974, the Ethiopians had reached a breaking point when the emperor became notorious for his attempts to conceal the existence of the Wolo famine that had hit the Wolo province in 1973. The concealment was so widespread that it became to be known as the hidden famine. 200,000 men, 650,000 cattle, 525,000 sheep, 450,000 goats, and 50,000 camels all perished without the world ever knowing about them. Reports of the famine were consistently ignored or denied by the emperor. In response to a report by UNICEF documenting famine conditions in July 1973, the Vice Minister of Planning stated, "If we have to describe the situation in the way you have in order to generate international assistance, then we don't need that assistance. The embarrassment to the government isn't worth it." When Haile Selassie later paid a visit to the area, he merely referred to natural disasters beyond human control that had often afflicted Ethiopia, and implied that little could be done to prevent them. The imperial government intentionally turned a deaf ear to the sufferings of the people, while autocratic rulers continued to live in luxury and even exported grain. The famine created a problem the emperor didn't see coming. Thousands of the famine-stricken fled to the cities, increasing the number of unemployed, frustrated, and creating potential rebels. The prices of all essential commodities increased and dissatisfaction spread evenly amongst the armed forces, who now even demanded higher wages and salaries. System reduced fuel price increases and implemented price controls to check inflation. He also dismissed his Prime Minister, Aklelo Habtawald, and agreed to revise the constitution to make the Prime Minister answerable to a parliament, a change that in Ethiopian terms would amount to a major reform. However, on the 25th of February, a more serious revolt broke out in Asmara, the capital of Eritrea, led by a group of sergeants and corporals. The mutineers took control of a radio station and broadcasted demands of more pay and improved conditions of service. They also demanded the removal of the emperor's grandson, Admiral Alexander Desta, as the commander of the army, and other commanders they hated. On the 27th of February to the representatives of the armed forces, the emperor appealed to their nationalism and pleaded with them not to ask for more than the country could afford, and to also protect the country. He also made a raise of $15 right away and appointed Oxford-educated Endalka Makonnen as the new prime minister. Satisfied with what they had achieved, the mutineers went to the king, thanked him for the pay rises, expressed their loyalty to the crown, handed over the members of the old cabinet whom they had detained, and retired to their barracks, marking the end of the first round of the uprising. The most obvious question was if the army was going to come on the side of the government and uphold law and order, or whether it was going to support the resistance to the government. Well, within the armed forces, a group of officers conspired to take control. They met at the 4th Division headquarters in Addis Ababa at the end of June and formed a military committee which they named the DAG, literally meaning committee. The DAG wanted to maintain law and order, which seemingly looked that they would be on the side of the emperor or the government. The committee was composed of 110 representatives chosen by units of the armed forces to run the country. For many months, the DAG remained a shadowy organization. None of the names of its members were announced and also kept its activities secret from the public. King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah, Elect of God. These grand titles, bestowed upon Rastafari Makoen at his coronation in 1930, reflected not only his position as leader of an ancient civilization but also the profound impact he would have on Ethiopia and the world. His 44-year reign was a complex and often contradictory mix of modernization efforts, Pan-African leadership, and authoritarian rule, leaving behind a legacy that is still debated and analyzed today. He was a figure of immense global stature, a symbol of African pride and sovereignty in a time of widespread colonialism, yet also a ruler whose domestic policies often led to hardship and dissent within his own empire. This is the story of Haile Selassie, a man whose life was a tapestry of triumphs and tragedies, a monarch who straddled the line between tradition and modernity, and a titular governor of Salel, and by 18, he assumed control of his late father's province of Hara. At 24, he became the most powerful man in Ethiopia, serving as imperial regent. His rise was a combination of political acumen and fortuitous circumstances. Emperor Menelik II, ailing and under pressure to name a successor, initially favored his grandson, Lija Ayesu. However, due to Ayesu's youth, Ras Tessima Nedu was appointed regent, but he soon died. Ayesu, seizing the opportunity, declared himself ruler, bypassing senior members of the court. This move proved unpopular, and after Menelik's death in 1913, Ayesu's reign was marked by instability and accusations of converting to Islam. In 1916, he was deposed, and Menelik's daughter, Zuditu, was named empress, with Tefori as regent and heir. After 14 years of political maneuvering and power struggles, Tefori emerged victorious. He first forced Zuditu to crown him king in 1928, and following her sudden death 2 years later, he was crowned Emperor Haile Selassie. The rise of Rastafarianism and the paradox of a king. Unbeknownst to the newly crowned emperor, news of his coronation sparked the birth of a new religion in Jamaica. Inspired by Marcus Garvey's call for Africans to look to Africa for a black king, and fueled by biblical interpretations and social realities, Rastafarians saw Haile Selassie's coronation as the fulfillment of prophecy. They proclaimed him as God incarnate, the King of Kings, the Messiah who would lead them to Zion, the promised land of Ethiopia. This divine status, bestowed upon him by a movement far from his own kingdom, would become a defining aspect of his global image. However, the reality of life in Selassie's Ethiopia contrasted sharply with the Rastafarian vision. Despite its ancient history and Christian heritage, Ethiopia in the 1930s was a feudal society, economically and technologically underdeveloped compared to its European and Asian counterparts. Slavery persisted, social mobility was limited, and modern amenities were scarce outside of Addis Ababa. Power and wealth were concentrated in the hands of a small elite, while the majority of Ethiopians lived as peasants under the control of landowners and clergy. The Italian invasion and exile. The greatest test of faith for Rastafarians, and for Selassie himself, came in 1935 when Mussolini's Italy invaded Ethiopia. Despite Selassie's pleas to the League of Nations for intervention, the international community failed to act decisively, and he was forced into exile. This period of exile, while a personal humiliation, ironically solidified his image as a symbol of African resistance against European colonialism. His iconic speech at the League of Nations, where he condemned the war's inaction, became a powerful testament to his leadership and his commitment to his nation. Return and modernization. With the help of British forces, Selassie returned to Ethiopia in 1941 after the Italians were driven out. This return further fueled the Rastafarian belief in his divinity and cemented his status as a symbol of African resilience.
So this is part 2. So we've explored certain aspects of his reign, and his demise as well. The rise of the educated, the rise of the Derg. Ethiopia still has problems, a huge, vast country. Some parts are agricultural based, some parts are Christian based, So there's various aspects to his reign. In my opinion, I think he tried to bring the country to a modern stage, and there was mistakes, and what really happened was the end of a monarchy in Ethiopia. And I truly think there was other aspects like the control of Ethiopia, also the breaking up of a monarchy, and we've got to remember this was in a time of world wars and the rise of the Cold War as well. So there's so many different angles to this. But hey, like, share and subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comment section. This is JTV, agree or disagree, this is a place for you.
He embarked on a modernization drive, focusing on education, legal reforms, and infrastructure development. He also played a prominent role in the Pan-African movement, co-founding the Organization of African Unity, OAU, and hosting its headquarters in Addis Ababa. Domestic dissent and the erosion of power. Despite his international acclaim, Selassie faced growing dissent at home. His efforts to unify Ethiopia by promoting Amhara culture and language alienated other ethnic groups. Famine in the Tigray province in 1958, coupled with accusations of government inaction, further damaged his reputation. The concentration of power and wealth in the hands of the elite and the lack of social mobility fueled resentment among the population. Selassie's modernization efforts inadvertently created a new class of educated Ethiopians who were increasingly dissatisfied with the slow pace of change and the absolute monarchy. Calls for democracy grew louder, and the 1960 coup attempt, though unsuccessful, revealed the depth of the discontent. The ongoing conflict with Eritrean separatists further strained the empire's resources and Selassie's authority. The final years an overthrow. In the 1970s, as Selassie's international stature grew, his grip on power at home weakened. His government's human rights record, economic stagnation, and suppression of dissent led to widespread unrest. The devastating famine in Wollo province in 1972 and the emperor's lavish birthday celebrations amidst the suffering proved to be the final straw. In 1974, a group of radical left-wing army officers known as the Derg seized power, ending over 3,000 years of Ethiopian dynastic rule. Selassie was placed under house arrest and died under mysterious circumstances the following year. A complex legacy. Haile Selassie's legacy is a complex and multifaceted